This week on Just Solutions. 50 years ago this month, incarcerated men in Attica, a maximum security prison in western New York, held an uprising to demand an end to the dehumanizing conditions they were being held in. After 4 days, 39 people, including 10 hostages, were killed by state police and guards. After the massacre, the prisoners were subject to systematic torture and brutality by authorities. Attica paved the way for the modern anti-prison movement. Today, we're joined by Tyrone Larkins, one of the Attica survivors, Sarah Kunstler, daughter of civil rights attorney William Kunstler, who negotiated on behalf of the protesting inmates at Attica, and Soffiyah Elijah, Executive Director of Alliance of Families for Justice, a group that is working to change the landscape of injustice in American courts and prisons. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Well, Sarah, in fact, won't be able to join us today, but we are delighted to have Tyrone and Soffiyah join us as we are approaching the 50th anniversary of the Attica Rebellion, Uprising. It's been called so many different things. And Tyrone, you were there in Attica 50 years ago. You were a young man. You were in your early 20s. Take us through what conditions were like.
Oh, God. Attica in 1971 was one of the most, if not the most secure prison in New York State. Coupled with it being the most secure prison in New York State, referring to the bars and the walls, it was also one of the most brutal prisons in New York State. Correction officers didn't speak to you. They didn't speak at you. And the basic ways of communicating with men or men confined was the banging on the of their clubs on the wall. Two hits on the wall means stop. One hit on the wall means go. And there was a very hard lack of communication between prisoners and the people that kept the prisoners in prison itself. The racial dynamics was very important to realize that Attica is located in one of the rural parts of the state of New York, Wyoming County, New York, western part of New York State. And the majority of the people that was confined there were people of color that came from basically the urban centers of New York State itself. So you had a dichotomy and an antithesis, I guess you can say, regarding the kept and the keeper.
I think that's such an important point that's so relevant to the current prison industrial complex that we'll talk about in just a moment. But getting back to 1971, you were transferred to Attica in January of that year, and 9 months later is when the rebellion happened. And I know there was severe overcrowding. Many more people were incarcerated there than the prison had been designed for. There was very bad living conditions, poor food, restricted access to family visits, many more issues that were being raised. But also this was happening while there was a very large civil rights movement happening outside of the prison. What was the connection between the two, the civil rights that were happening outside and then prisoners' awareness about their own living conditions and their need to advocate for themselves?
Okay. We're going to the late 60s and the early 70s. Throughout the United States, or I could say throughout the world, there was a large protest against the war in Vietnam. We had slogans like "Hell no, we won't go," and that basically referred to the Vietnam conflict that the United States was engaged in with North and South Vietnam. And we could say the racial overtones of people of color, particularly Black people of color, being made aware of who they are. And we went by slogans, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, Black is beautiful. as opposed to being recognized as Negroes in America. So that in effect, that in itself, or those two factors itself, created a conflict between the keeper and the kept. As I said earlier, the keeper came from rural America, which basically was right-wing thinking, and everything in America was great, even the conflict in Vietnam, so forth, etc. And black people, as they seen them, was supposed to be called Negroes because this is what they was taught. But when you have a young man coming into the prison system that's saying, no, don't call me Negro no more, because that's being identified as a neo-slave, identifying me as a black person where my descendant is from Africa. And that created conflicts.
And that conflict between the keeper and the kept, as you frame it, Tyrone, that very much continued on when the rebellion actually happened. What was your sense of that? Was it organized? Was it something that was more spontaneous? Because I know there had been organized demands that were being made by prisoners before the rebellion. They were organizing themselves to say these are the conditions that we need to have improved, but they weren't being met with any type of response. So do you have memories of that day of when the rebellion itself kicked off?
Yes. Basically, the rebellion was a spontaneous situation that happened, that actually started the night before on the 8th in housing block A in that yard. And it came about because two individuals was horsing around in the yard, and ironically one was black and the other one was white, and it was no real conflict, nothing serious. It was guys practicing football, and the prison guards didn't like that. They told them to break it up, and the guys refused, and the guys was locked up. Later on that night, the prison guards took them out of their cell and beat them and took them to a segregation unit within the prison itself. The next day, on the 9th, the morning of September 9th, when it all started, I happened to be working in the prison industrial area, the metal shop. And the first thing I heard about 9 o'clock, 9:30, somewhere in that half an hour frame, I heard the emergency whistle or the emergency horns in the prison going off. Doot, doot, doot. And the only time I've ever heard that in the past was when somebody escaped out the prison. So my first reaction was that somebody escaped or somebody was attempting to escape at that time. But a few minutes afterwards, I've seen guys come rushing into the metal shop who I haven't seen. Oh, the only time I've ever seen them, rather, was in the facility mess hall, the child hall, I should say. And when I seen them and I heard all the howling and screaming, I knew it was something that was out of whack. And we call it today a riot, a prison riot. And you know what? We all winded up, for the most part, prisoners anyway, into D Block Yard. And from that standpoint, while we was in D Block Yard, that's when the organizing started of how this whole situation was going to be handled with the powers that be.
I think that's such a great point to emphasize, that it was then an organized effort. After that initial rebellion, there were elected spokespeople. Folks were elected to be the spokespeople, and that negotiators were called in, including civil rights attorney William Kunstler and some others. And there were several days of negotiations. But then, as we've heard, history has somehow recorded, but not always accurately, there was a brutal crackdown ordered by then New York State Governor Rockefeller. And so what happened was the state guard, state police came in and shot so many people. It was the bloodiest uprising or quelling of an uprising in a prison in US history. You were shot too. Tyrone, take us back to that. What are your memories of that?
Okay. Well, we were ratcheted up to, I believe, Friday night, Saturday night. Well, you know what? Friday night, I believe, was the last time I seen Bill Kunstler, and to his credit, God bless the dead, and may he be with God as his spirit should be with him right now. He was a decent individual. He was a straight shooter. He came in into the prison yard as a negotiator for the prisoners, and he was a natural guy that talked down to earth with everybody, and he was good. And the last time I seen Bill Kunstler, I believe it was that Saturday night or Friday Saturday night, I believe it was. And I heard him saying to somebody, I don't know, they're negotiating kind of hard with you guys and so forth, etc., which I really wasn't paying that much attention to at that point. Then to go into what happened Saturday night or Sunday night, let me say Sunday night, there was like a gloom that came over the prison itself. A heavy mist started coming down. It was like, it wasn't a rain and it wasn't a drizzle. It was like a mist. And that lasted until that Monday morning, the 13th. And then Monday morning, I remember next in the morning, I heard a helicopter coming over the prison yard, over the prison itself, and it came over the yard once, didn't say nothing. Nothing was being said. And then the second time it came over, there was an announcement coming from the helicopter. Let me correct that. Before the announcement was made, a heavy gas came out of the helicopter. This gas was so strong, it literally knocked me to my knees when I inhaled it. And it cleaned up my whole sinuses, and it kept me in such a perpetual state of laying down. I couldn't really get up off the ground. And then the announcement came: lay down on the ground, put your hands on your heads, and you will not be harmed. Well, you know what? The same time that announcement was being made, I seen the ground around me shake and jump. And it only took me a matter of seconds to realize that gunshots was being fired in the yard and fired at me. And the first two times I was hit, and I was shot kind of bad, laying down. I was still trying to figure out, how did I get shot in my foot and my leg at the same time, and in my hands, which was on top of my head. And that was on the 13th of September, 1971. And National Guard's corpsmen pulled me out the yard, took me out on the stretcher, and took me out of harm's way, if you could say, to a certain extent. And I was lined up on the side of the prison where the special housing unit was at. And when I got there, I seen maybe 40, 50 people in stretchers that was in similar situations such as I was. And come to find out after the fact that 39 people was killed.
Well, 10
and I don't know how many was wounded.
10 of those people were hostages. And as I said, history hasn't always reported or recorded this accurately, because the narrative that was put out by authorities was that those 10 hostages were killed by prisoners. That was a blatant lie. They were shot, and they were shot by the state authorities. Soffiyah Elijah, can you talk a little bit about the narrative that was put out after Attica in defense of this state-sanctioned violence and this heavy-handed approach to criminalization? Because as I mentioned then, New York Governor Rockefeller a lot of his decisions around this disproportionate response to the uprising, was around his own political ambitions and this tough on crime attitude that he had. And that has actually been a huge part of politics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So Governor Rockefeller had aspirations to be president, and he was in constant communication with then President Nixon about how he was handling or mishandling the situation in Attica. And immediately after he ordered the violent retaking of the prison, working along with the media, put out a narrative saying that the men in Attica had murdered the hostages. In fact, said that they had slit the hostages' throats. And that was the story that the media ran with for quite some time until the courageous coroner reported that, in fact, the cause of death for all of the people who had died was from gunshot wounds, and none of them had had their throats slit. And it was quite some time before the general public would accept the truth that the coroner was brave enough to report. But in the meantime, quite a few of the men who had been in the yard were indicted by the state and faced criminal and murder charges, and were tried before they were eventually acquitted. And then they brought civil suits against the state. And the state dragged out those suits for many, many years before any justice was done for the Attica brothers.
Well, Soffiyah, the organization that you're the executive director of, and you are a longtime human rights attorney, you've been involved in prison reform, prison abolition for many, many years. The Alliance of Families for Justice, you advocate on behalf of prisoners, but you also shine a light on the prison industrial complex and its impact on society. The demands back then by the prisoners, they're still so relevant to what we hear today: inadequate food, overcrowding, lack of access to proper family visits, the fact that these prisons are often located in rural areas that are relying heavily economically on the prison industrial complex. And as Tyrone made the point, then you have such a disparity between the prisoner and the prison guards. Has anything changed in terms of those demands that we heard from those prisoners in Attica? How much of those are still relevant today, those concerns?
I would say almost all of them are as relevant today as they were before. Right after the Attica Rebellion, for a short while, programming increased. Access to literature and educational opportunities increased for a brief while, but then the state's repressive hand came down hard. And what you find in most of the state's prisons today is very similar to the conditions that existed 50 years ago. Even through the dead heat of summer, there's no air conditioning in the prisons. In the winter, there's very, very little heat. Access to programs is difficult. Access to educational opportunities is limited. Brutality remains the same. The racism throughout the New York State prison system remains the same, and Attica is one of the most notorious places for that. So unfortunately, very little has changed, and that's why it is so important for people to remain vigilant to try to change this. And actually, we cannot reform the prison system. The only way to address this is to completely overhaul it, start from scratch, and come up with a better way to address people's needs instead of putting people in cages and suffering.
And how much is this connected to this political ideology that elected representatives, certainly when they're campaigning, have this tough on crime approach? We've seen this time and time again, certainly in New York City, folks running for various different offices have this tough on crime approach. We talked about that with then New York Governor Rockefeller. Are we still seeing that as part of our political narrative when it comes to prisons and when it comes to criminal justice?
You absolutely still see that. And part of the reason is because the guards union and the police unions are very, very powerful. And they put a lot of campaign money behind elected officials, people who are running for various offices, to try to secure their position and secure their jobs, even though the crime rate in New York State has dropped drastically and the prison population has dropped by over 40,000 the prison guards union still fights to make sure that prisons are not closed and that their jobs are secure. And you find the same thing with the police department throughout New York City and other parts of the state. So the political interests that underlie the pressure on elected officials cannot be ignored.
Let's talk about the economics of this. Tyrone brought this up, that Attica itself is located in upstate New York. Many of these large prisons are located in rural areas, that these communities are economically reliant. There are no other economic opportunities for folks in these communities. And that in and of itself is part of the problem when we look at the economics of warehousing these people in these rural areas. Sophia, I know this is part of the work that you're doing at Alliance of Families for Justice, is to raise awareness of some of these dynamics.
Yeah, and I think it's important when we talk about the lack of economic alternatives in these rural communities. Well, the economic opportunities in the communities from which the people who are incarcerated come from are also very, very limited. But the narrative never seems to focus on the fact that those individuals don't have an opportunity to realize their dreams and to realize their potential. So the concern about economic opportunities has to cover all of the people who are affected by the prison industrial complex, not just the people who make a living off of running prisons and keeping people in cages.
Tyrone, what would you like people to know about what it is like to be incarcerated? Because very often when we talk about prison abolition or prison reform, this narrative emerges. Well, if people didn't commit crime, they wouldn't be in there in the first place. And that totally denies the humanity of people who are being incarcerated, let alone the racial inequity that we have in our incarceration system. What would you like people to know about what it means to be incarcerated in this country?
Interesting question. A very interesting question. And speaking for myself, hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, speaking for myself, it seemed like the pictures left. Speaking for myself, I've made a metamorphosis after Attica. I had to do a lot of soul searching and questioning of how did I get here and what do I want the end result to be. Unfortunately, I did 29 years straight after Attica from the crime in which I was convicted of. And I was released in 1997. I came to prison 1968, released in 1997, a total of 29 years. And within those 29 years, I had to do a lot of introspecting and ask myself the simple question, did I want my past to be my future? And I came to the conclusion, no. And I came up with an analysis of how to change myself. So the brutality of prison, what it did was make me stronger to a certain extent, not to be complacent or to accept the conditions of prison, just to bear with it and keep intact or keeping in touch with my mind to say, you know what, there's going to be a better day and a better way. So with that being said, the events that happened 50 years ago, always be part of me, and I would always say that, you know what, these conditions have to change for the generations that's coming after me.
We'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching and your thoughts on this. And the legacy of Attica, 50 years later, we're still dealing with the same problems. Sophia, from the work that you have been doing around prison abolition over the years, what do you think is the biggest misconception that we have as a society about our current system of incarceration?
I think one of the things that the narrative around mass incarceration is missing is how it destroys whole communities. It destroys families, individuals, and communities. And we need healthy communities to have a healthy society. And unfortunately, because the concerns and the suffering of mostly Black and brown people in this country are marginalized and swept under the rug, not enough attention has been placed on this issue. If you reverse the demographics of the prison industrial complex tomorrow, I can assure you that by Sunday it would be ended. And so we have to be vigilant and make sure that everybody understands that as a whole society, we all suffer by the damage that we're doing to the families, individuals, and their communities.
And of course, that racial component is undeniable when you look at the disproportionate number of Black and brown people who are currently incarcerated. Tyrone, you said that being in prison gave you strength, but I've also heard you speak about the strength that you got to survive being in prison from your grandmother. Your grandmother was one generation away from slavery. When we talk about slavery, it's often in an abstract way. It's like that was so far in the past. That wasn't in the past, particularly when we're seeing ongoing racial injustice. Talk a little bit about that, about what that means to be so close to that, the strength that your grandmother gave you.
Sure. Well, take into account, and I'm sure universally it's accepted. I'm my grandmother's firstborn grandchild from her firstborn child, which was my mother. So my grandmother's firstborn was a female, naturally, my mother, and her firstborn child, my mother, was a male. So historically, spiritually, and any other way you want to look at it, I was held into a certain reverence. And fortunately, my grandmother raised me and had a lot of influence over me. My grandmother told me certain things that she didn't tell her own children. And she told me as much because I would question her about certain things. And when I asked her about her mother one day, I remember I was a little boy, and I said, Mama, how's your mama? Do you know your mama? And she stopped and she looked at me, and she was trying to fight the tears away from her eyes. And she told me about the plantation that my great grandmother came from in Orangeburg, South Carolina. But it was up to her, my grandmother itself, to make a better way for her children and to make a better way for me. And, you know, the ironic part about it, I seen my grandmother do days work in New York City. And some of your viewers may not know what that is. That's when Black women went to work in rich people's houses, cleaning their houses, cooking for them, so forth, etc., for under the minimum wage. And my grandmother raised me, my children, and her children until I guess a point of luck came our way when she had the ability, with the help of my uncle and my mother, to purchase a home in a different part of Brooklyn in 1957. And it wasn't so much of moving to a new neighborhood that changed our attitudes. It was those things that was forced in us from a child. And to give you an example, and I hope I'm not going too far off, I remember my grandmother telling me about the big sickness in 1919. And I asked her about that. And it was during the conversation we was having when she told me when she first came to New York City, she lived in Harlem, up on 146th Street in Convent. And she called it the big sickness. And I asked her, I said, Mama, what was the big sickness? She told me, everybody downtown where I go to work at is sick from the big sickness. And it was the plague at that time, 1918, 1919, 1920 plague that she told me about. And I asked her, did she get sick? She said, no, because we keep ourselves well up here. We do well, we eat well, and we be well, and we are okay. And ironically, that stuck with me until until the pandemic that hit the world last year, the big sickness, and that always came back to me. And once again, having the fortitude and knowledge of an elder in my family, it kept me, had me the wherewithal to survive.
Well, Tyrone Larkins, Soffiyah Elijah, thank you so much for being with us. There is an opportunity for people to engage further in this on the 50th anniversary of Attica. There are 2 virtual events happening, one September 9th, one September 13th. People can find out more at atticaisallofus.org, or stay tuned to Free Speech TV. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank you both for joining us. Invite our viewers to also subscribe to the Just Solutions podcast, wherever you get your podcast, and tune in same time, same place next week for more Just Solutions from Free Speech TV. Thank you.
Thank you.